Good morning, wonderful people of the audience. Welcome to the first annual Belize KULCHA Symposium, organized by Heritage Education Network Belize. I am your host this morning, Linmara Rosado. Before we get into it, we would like to thank our media partners, the National Channel and Colorblind Multimedia Productions, for rebroadcasting this symposium. This symposium is brought to you by Heritage Education Network Belize, which is a newly founded, non-governmental, non-profit organization dedicated to culture and heritage through education, capacity building, and advocacy. It is spearheaded by Miss Sylvia Bate, Miss Ella Bekeshi, Dr. Rebecca Freidel Juan, and Miss April Martinez, four female archaeologists and heritage professionals who, in early 2020, formed Heritage Education Network Belize as a response to disruptions from the pandemic. Miss Bati is an archaeologist and heritage manager who began volunteering on archaeological research projects in Belize at the age of 12. She earned a bachelor's degree in anthropology with a concentration in archaeology from Galen University in Belize. She was a Chevening scholar and pursued a master's degree in public archaeology at the University of College London. Miss Bati has worked in the field of research and education for the past 9 years at the Institute of Archaeology, Niche. She's a co-founder of Fahina Archaeology Outreach and organized, along with Dr. Freidel Juan, the Sokots Archaeology and Culture Fair to create opportunities for culture and knowledge exchange between archaeologists and the communities in which they work. I present to you now Director Sylvia Bate.
Thank you for that introduction, Ms. Rosado. I would like to thank all of our viewers and presenters for joining us today for day one of the KULCHA Symposium. I would also like to acknowledge and thank our network of volunteers who are currently working tirelessly on the back end to bring this symposium to you, our viewers. Heritage Education Network Belize was founded a little over a year ago by Ms. Ella Bekeshi, Ms. April Martinez, Dr. Rebecca Freidel Juan, and I. We are an independent, non-governmental organization led by 4 women archaeologists. Through different circumstances, we have all come to dedicate our lives to conducting research in Belize and creating actionable change from that research. In past years, we have each independently conducted research or community-based initiatives. Ms. Bekeshi through her research at Indian Church and Lamanai, Dr. Freidel Juan and I through Fahina Archaeology Outreach, and Ms. April Martinez through her student-based initiatives at the University of Belize. What Heritage Education Network Belize represents is a synergy of our independent efforts and a deep friendship that has formed through our shared love of archaeology and vision for Belize. We are a platform that advocates for the multivocality of culture and the representation and inclusivity of all Belizeans, especially those from descendant, indigenous, and historically underrepresented communities, in all decision-making processes, particularly those that affect our self-actualization. Heritage Education Network Belize supports local, regional, and international efforts and initiatives that effect change through the inclusion of culture in all areas of society, especially wellness, sustainable development, climate preparedness, research, and education. The KULCHA Symposium embodies the goals of our organization by creating an inclusive and accessible platform for knowledge exchange. At the heart of the symposium and our organization is the diversity of our culture and the opportunity for us to pivot our experience of culture to one of inclusivity. Thank you.
Thank you, Director Betty, for that insight into Heritage Education Network Belize. Now, ladies and gentlemen, let me introduce you to our co-director, Miss Ella Bekeshi. Miss Bekeshi is an archaeologist and cultural heritage professional who has worked in Belize since 2014. She studied archaeology and read for her master's in cultural heritage at University College London. Her master's research was an ethnographic study at Indian Church Village and Lamanai Archaeological Reserve, where she looked at the relationship between the village and the archaeological site, engaging with topics of community engagement, tourism benefits, and local identity. Her interests are in community engagement and responsible and sustainable heritage tourism. Ladies and gentlemen, Director Ella Bekeshi.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for the introduction, Ms. Rosado. We are grateful to be here today, and we welcome all interested viewers tuning in during these coming days. I am also extremely proud to be here alongside my co-directors, who are, in my opinion, three amazing, intelligent, strong, hardworking, currently very tired, and kind women. And Henry would be nothing without their dedication and input, I can safely say. We have been friends and colleagues for some time before starting Heritage Education Network Belize in the middle of the COVID pandemic. And in just 1 year, Heritage Education Network Belize has grown to be a community of over 2,500 people interested in culture and heritage. Now, our goal is to safeguard and promote culture and heritage as a means to sustainability through education, capacity building, and advocacy. And we cannot do that without open dialogue and the support and participation of our constantly growing community. The goals of the Culture Symposium also overlap with our organizational mission. In these next few days, we will create a virtual space for scholars and interested persons to initiate interdisciplinary dialogue, to bridge boundaries between academia and the broader public, and to showcase the relevance of Belizean language, culture, heritage, archaeology, anthropology, and the arts to daily life and global issues. And before we begin this 3-day journey together, I would like to say thanks to all the volunteers and the presenters who are helping to make this event possible, and to all the wonderful people in Belize who supported us as an NGO. We are a volunteer-led organization, which means that everyone who is bringing you this event worked in their free time out of passion and love for Belize. And we do hope that you will enjoy our symposium, and thank you for tuning in.
Thank you, Director Bekeshi. I now take the opportunity to introduce Dr. Freidel Juan. Dr. Freidel Juan is an anthropologist and paleoethnobotanist with a PhD in ecological anthropology from the University of Texas at San Antonio. Her dissertation reconstructed a history of socio-ecological relationships in the Mopan River Valley of Western Belize, bridging across many disciplines and audiences to create a holistic view of the past. She has conducted research in Belize since 2013 and is passionate about education and community outreach, having taught at institutions both in the United States and Belize. Dr. Freidel Juan has made Belize her home and hopes her scholarly and community contributions can add to a robust and resilient Belizean society. Ladies and gentlemen, Director Dr. Rebecca Freidel Juan.
Thank you, Ms. Rosado. I am very humbled to be here today alongside my co-directors, and I'm honored to be able to welcome you, our viewers, to the first of hopefully many Belize KULCHA Symposia. As a volunteer-led and non-governmental organization, we truly are community-driven and focused. We formed last year to break the boundaries that we saw being formed by many issues, particularly during the pandemic, namely knowledge sharing and engagement with culture. With everything shifting to online due to COVID, we knew that these activities would need a space online as well, or they would remain under the threat of being lost. So we formed our Facebook page and have continued to grow from there, the growth of which culminates today in the KULCHA Symposium. As Ms. Bakeshi mentioned, in these next few days, we hope to create a virtual space for scholars and interested persons to initiate interdisciplinary dialogue and bridge boundaries. This knowledge will live longer than these 3 days and in an accessible and digital library of research and cultural information for the public. These actionable steps, we hope, will encourage inclusivity in the cultural and heritage fields by involving citizens and young scholars and provide a platform to share research and experiences. We hope that you will continue to join us on our journey to achieve these things, and we welcome all to participate in the coming days or at any point in the future. Thank you for being here today, and a huge thank you to my co-directors and all of the amazing volunteers and presenters that helped to make this happen.
Thank you, Dr. Rebecca Fredel Juan. And now I present to you Director April Martinez. Ms. Martinez is an archaeologist and osteoarchaeologist who has worked in the field for 10 years in Belize. She obtained a Bachelor of Arts in Anthropology from Galen University and a Master of Arts in Mesoamerican Archaeology and Osteoarchaeology from Leiden University in the Netherlands. Her research entails analyzing different archaeological methods applied in ancient Maya sacred spaces, caves, and burials across Belize. She joined the University of Belize as an adjunct lecturer in 2017 and became a full-time lecturer in 2018, teaching history and anthropology. I present to you Director April Martinez.
Thank you, Ms. Rosado, for that lovely introduction, and thank you to our viewers at home and abroad for tuning into this historic event. I would like to express how humbled I am to be here alongside these wonderful co-directors and ladies who are friends and colleagues. Echoing those sentiments of my co-directors, I just want to express how of a momentous an event this is for Belize and how proud we are as directors to be able to bring it to life for our communities. Heritage Education Network was founded by the four of us in archaeology who wanted to help our respected communities during a time of crisis. Never did we think that HENB, Heritage Education Network Belize, would grow so much in such a short period of time. We all had the same vision for this organization to be a platform where anyone could express and discuss their ideas for cultural preservations, safeguarding heritage. And so far, I believe we have done just that. I want to express how grateful we all are to our presenters who took the time to share their research on our platform. If I told you that HENB is a small organization with just us four directors and a handful of our dedicated volunteers running the show, I hoped I shocked you. But I also hope that it shows you how much we value in preserving, retaining, safeguarding, and reviving our cultural heritage. And of course, sharing that with all of you here today. One of our goals is to inspire young and upcoming researchers, like those who have joined us today and for the rest of the couple of days, to carry on the work. There is so much to continue searching for in this beautiful country of ours, and hopefully we can be having your research and presentations in our next KULCHA Symposium. Well, let's not delay anymore and begin the event. Thank you.
Thank you, Director Martinez. We now present to you the Honorable Francis Fonseca, an economist, attorney at law, and cultural and educational leader with over 24 years of civil service to Belize. He has been instrumental in the development of Belize's cultural and educational system through his role as minister responsible for culture and education. We are honored today to have a few remarks from Honorable Francis Fonseca, the Minister of Education, Culture, Science, and Technology.
It is my great honor and pleasure to participate in this historic first annual Belize KULCHA Symposium. I am excited to welcome you to join us in keeping up with language, culture, heritage, and arts in Belize. I wish to offer my congratulations and respect to Heritage Education Network Belize for organizing this research symposium, which provides a much needed forum for community education and engagement, advocacy, and capacity building. Education is generally viewed as a formalized process of the transfer of knowledge and skills within a society through established institutions of learning. For us here in Belize, education has a wider and deeper meaning, one which challenges us to ensure that all our people are provided with an opportunity to acquire the capacity and attitudes for full and active participation in the development of our nation. Equally important is a strong commitment to an education system that promotes national pride, positive values for productive living, a strong work ethic, wholesome self-esteem, and civic responsibility, while cultivating and instilling in our people a strong sense of national identity, confidence, and independence, along with a spirit of inquiry and openness. We recognize that heritage and culture are inextricably linked to education. Culture is education. For us in Belize, culture and heritage is about self-love. It is about national identity learning. The root line orientation of our cultural education begins with African and Mayan history. This is the foundation of our national identity. The next period is that of resistance from 1491 to 1981. This is the story of our people forging a new cultural and social space in our sovereign and independent nation-state of Belize. We are now in a period of contemporary thinking. In a global space with Belize in the heart of Central America and the Caribbean, struggling to make good on the promise and hope of independence and working to coexist with our sister nations. This year's symposium is virtual. Our world community continues to struggle with the unprecedented challenges brought on by the COVID-19 pandemic. Our lives have changed. Our education system has been disrupted. This global crisis has revealed the glaring and unacceptable inequities and weaknesses in our education system. The pandemic has also exposed both old and new cultural divisions, many with deep ideological roots. Culture is dynamic and evolving. For culture and education to thrive, we must engage in research. Research is the hallmark of a growing, more enlightened society. Change and reform is grounded in meaningful, collaborative, and productive research for national dialogue and good. We must promote a culture of research and link research to teaching and learning. Organizations like Heritage Education Network Belize help to facilitate the environment and develop the infrastructure necessary for research to become a core function of higher education in Belize. This symposium advances this objective. I look forward to the presentations that will be made from so many different distinguished contributors. Once again, welcome. Together, let us continue the work of promoting and keeping up with language, culture, heritage, and arts in Belize.
Thank you, Honorable Francis Fonseca, for opening the first Belize KULCHA Symposium. We're looking forward to these 3 days to learn more about Belize and Belizean culture and heritage from our amazing presenters. But first, a little about the next 3 days. We will have 3 full days of presentations. We stream the conference live on our Facebook and YouTube channels, so anyone can tune in at any time. We will have multiple live sessions each day. You can view the various segments for each day by downloading our program from our website, www.heritagebelize.org/symposium. We have organized the conference to have a morning and afternoon live session. And don't worry, we have a lunch break in between. Please don't forget to support Heritage Education Network Belize and the KULCHA Symposium by donating to the cause on their website, our website, or via the link shown throughout the sessions. Now, without further ado, we officially begin the first Belize KULCHA Symposium. Dr. Rebecca Freidel Juan, also a Heritage Education Network Belize director, will be moderating our morning session. Dr. Juan, you may take it away.
Good morning and welcome again. Thank you, Ms. Rosado, for all of those lovely introductory remarks. It's my pleasure to be able to kick off the first of many sessions for our symposium. We are starting our exploration of Belizean culture with a focus on our past to highlight the rich heritage that Belize and its region has in this session entitled Ancient Maya Archaeology. Archaeology is the exploration of humanity's past through material remains, and Belize has had a long history of archaeological research. We are honored to have with us today many experts in ancient Maya archaeology, leading the field in new and exciting directions. These experts explore the origins of early populations to this area, architecture as a dynamic means of cultural expression, and music as forms of human knowledge, language, and emotion. What is clear from these diverse presentations is the vibrant and deep human history that has laid the foundation for the cultural diversity of modern-day Belize. We hope that Belizeans feel a sense of pride and respect for this heritage, which continues to inspire millions across the globe. Our first presenter is Professor Fred Valdez, who is a professor in the Department of Anthropology at University of Texas, Austin. He serves as director of the Texas Archaeological Research Lab and also directs the program for Belize Archaeological Project in Northwest Belize. His research includes investigations of social political developments among pre-Maya through post-classic Maya, studies of material culture, and human-environment interplay, specifically concerns of inequity, resilience, and adaptation. He is a recognized national and international scholar with numerous publications and presentations. We will now hear from Professor Valdez about Belize and the earliest Maya, archaeological data and new interpretations.
Valdez, and I am honored, pleased to be presenting today. I'm going to be, as the title will say, I am speaking on Belize and what we believe to be the earliest Maya. I first want to thank and congratulate the organizing committee of this first Belize KULCHA Symposium. It's wonderful to see, and obviously, I think already successful. I also want to thank Amanda Adam for a lot of technical assistance in terms of this recording and so forth. The idea of the earliest Maya has been around for many, many decades. And people have often wondered about who are the earliest Maya, what did they look like, and so forth. And so this, I hope, will add some information. I hope not confuse too much. But I'm going to discuss from the earliest peoples in Belize, those that came through, into those who then established or began horticulture, the cultivating of crops in essence, and how the Maya perhaps are directly involved into that whole process. My focus is on northern Belize, an area specifically more northeast Belize, where Koloha and Cobweb Swamp, or Rancho as it's known on the old Northern Highway, is located. And that will be the sort of center of where a lot of information comes. It happens to be a location where we get early materials that are considered to be pre-Maya, as well as some of the earliest Maya materials. So a brief chronology, there are in places sort of pre-Paleo-Indian or the earliest Paleo-Indian periods that go back perhaps 20 to 22,000. These dates vary quite a bit, depends on who you speak with, et cetera. And Belize has some of this material according to early research by Richard S. or Scotty McNeish. So that's an aspect that is there. The Paleo-Indian part, particularly what's known as Clovis culture, is clearly represented in Belize and throughout the New World. So Belize was a significant player among the earliest Maya and so forth, or earliest inhabitants, sorry. Following the Paleo-Indian period is this archaic component. The archaic peoples were hunter-gatherers early on, but by 3400 BC, we know that at least by that point, horticulture, the cultivating or the taking care of crops, the processing of certain crops, domestication in essence is already in play. And by 2000 BC, in some places to 1000 BC, as happens to be the case across much of the Maya lowlands, by 1000 BC, we see settled villages and pottery producers and people that we would call the Maya. And that's that pre-classic or formative period. Here's an example of the kinds of things that the Paleo-Indian Clovis peoples would have had with them. The taller stem point here, the taller lanceolate point here has this flute at the bottom, and that's to allow for a wooden haft so it doesn't break the wooden component part. A here in this illustration is a fluted point. There's that chunk that's missing from the bottom, has been intentionally removed. It helps to thin the base to be able to haft that onto a piece of wood or a spear, for example. This particular point, a Clovis point, Clovis-related point, comes from northwest Belize near the village of August Pine Ridge in the Orange Walk district. Incredibly important point. Late in the Paleo-Indian period and into that archaic that I mentioned earlier are these kinds of points that have these stems and barbs. And this is an archaic point known as the low point. I'll come back to that in a few slides later. Lots of these points are used on the ends of spears, as is shown here. And a particular tool is developed called the atlatl. And the atlatl is this stick of sorts, can be made of bone, can be made of wood. It has a hook at one end, and that's to capture the spear at this far end. And it's as you see in this figure in the lower right, becomes an extension of the arm. And this is what allows hunters to throw the spear at a greater distance with greater force and much more accuracy. Really important for taking down large animals. So the Paleo Indians are known for the large animals, mastodon, mammoth, and so forth. And that changes as climate changes, as the ice starts to melt, and we get the modern world as we know it today. So here's where some of the earliest sites in Mesoamerica happen to be. Belize certainly has some of these earliest phases that go back perhaps into that pre-Clovis period. And it is definitely has strong representation for that Paleo-Indian period. Here's what some of those Paleo-Indians might have been up to, depends on where they were and the area, et cetera. But the notion that these large mammoths, mastodons, so forth, were taken down in boggy areas where they couldn't move around so fast. It was easier to deal with them. And those large animals provide lots of great resources. Skins for clothing, for shelter, bone that can be used in various ways. The upper right, this individual about to break a large bone open, perhaps to extract the marrow, which is high in protein and so forth. And of course, that's besides the fact that this would produce a lot of meat for these groups that are traveling around to take advantage of. In lower central Mexico, in Tehuacan Valley, this top area is that Paleo-Indian point. These three phases in the middle are the Archaic. So we go from the early Archaic, and you still have these band level societies, which means small autonomous groups, independent groups, family-sized, a few dozen people at the most. And they're moving around from area to area to take advantage of resources, et cetera. By that last phase of the Archaic, 3400 BC, that becomes the important date. This is where we start to see, in this case, they're saying they see evidence for pit houses. We start to see evidence for possible platforms that are constructed in northern Belize near Kolha and so forth. And this is where we start to get some things that we now identify as crops. Here's a chronology in terms of the points, the artifacts that they have, Paleo-Indian points below, but you see, you start to see these stemmed points with these barbs, like I mentioned, for that low point that go up during this Archaic period. And there's that example again. And you notice the flaking, the technology part of it is very similar along the edges as it is to the Paleo point. But these are points that then extend into that Archaic period and help people to adapt to a new environment that's coming about. Along the way into that Archaic period, we start to get these kinds of tools that are called constricted unifaces. Constricted because they're constricted at the center part here, probably for hafting, a way to put a wooden thing around it to use, perhaps to shave down trees, to clean out some parts of trees, also used for agricultural purposes. The other side is flat. That's the uniface. They're worked on one side, they're worked on one face, chipped on one face, plain on the other. This is from a more northern area. We don't know that this would have applied directly to Belize, but these early hunters and gatherers moving about from place to place probably lived in simple structures like this, whether it's made of straw, of grasses, of palm fronds, and so forth, just to protect from the local environment, but would move about in these small groups, building nets and baskets and so forth. We also know from other areas across Mesoamerica and to the north of rock art. And this comes into play because we don't get this kind of preservation in Belize, but clearly these ideas, the symbolism and so forth was there and in place during the Archaic period. Some of the kinds of crops that come up early on include avocado, chili peppers, cotton, corn, and these were from the Archaic peoples, from the Archaic periods, especially that 3400 BC period at least, and then coming forward. Manos and metates, or pestles and mortars. We see the mano metate here, where most of us are familiar with these as tools. These are used to process the different plants and things that are made available. And not all plants are for food. Not everything is food. There's cotton and there's other materials that are used to make nets, to make baskets, to make mats, to make sandals. All of these things becoming important. But we tend to focus on the foods and the domestication of corn. We see these smaller cobs at the top on the left, or on the left on the lower illustration. Cobs that are very small at first and into the pre-classic and into the Maya period then become these larger cobs, sort of similar to the kind of corn that we expect and see today. Kinds of tools that were used in the past, but we don't have evidence for today, or not much evidence for, unless they're in a rock shelter or caved and preserved, were things made of wood and of bone. And those items, where they are preserved in those locations and places where we do see them, inform us about what the other archaic peoples in places like Kulcha and other spots in Belize would have been using, because those have now decayed due to the tropical environment. So in my estimation, a number of us who look at some of these concerns, we believe that the people who were exploiting the chert, the flint, for example, in northern Belize, the other environmental resources and plants and so forth, are the same folks that later become the Maya. And excuse me, and unfortunately, we don't identify them as Maya, as I said before, until around 1000 BC, give or take a couple of centuries. But at about 1000 BC, because of the permanent villages producing pottery and so forth. But the reality is, lots of these indications of who they are were there before this particular time period. So here are early important sites in early Mesoamerica. For Belize, I have Caye and Kulcha. I'll show some slides from that particular area that relate. When we get at Kulcha, we hit these floors with the spattering of charcoal in them and that glittery stuff. Those are fragments of shell beads that were being made. And the Maya were using these little drills, these chert drills, to make those particular beads. We also happen to have found in one location, because it was preserved, bone beads, these little anthropomorphic beads that are strung together. This is the excavations from Kulcha, and where we see these alignments of what look like rocks in this illustration. Those are the edges of the houses, of those platforms, and they're shaped and moved around over time as they expand and do other kinds of activities. Here's a photo that shows the same thing, and burials were placed outside of this particular platform that later was expanded. Caye, and I'll come back to this. At Kulcha, we can get to this middle pre-classic 1000 BC period within about a meter, about 3 feet from the ground surface. At a place like Caye in their plaza, here you see where some of their trenches were placed into that large plaza. These units are incredibly deep, meters and meters deep, because of all of the classic and other buildup over time. At Kulcha, we're fortunate that we can get to the earliest Maya very quickly, those that we definitely identify as Maya. We also see symbols incised or carved onto pottery, this cross sign or con sign, this sort of feather design, which tells us about not only the designs, but the symbols, perhaps ideology, belief systems that may have been in place. We get ceramic ocarinas or whistles, tells us something about the different kinds of activities that they were up to. Ultimately, though, it's all connected to the Maya Trinity or Mesoamerican triad when it comes to food, all important food for nutrition and subsistence, of corn, beans, and squash. Those are there in that archaic period. Those are already developed, identified, and utilized by the archaic peoples at least by 3400 BC and continues into the present day. So the Maya themselves at 1000 BC, in terms of their tools, in terms of their foods, in terms of how they process things, all of those things are already there. Even some of the symbolism is already there in the archaic period. There isn't any reason to really question, are these archaic folks the Maya? I think the Maya are direct descendants. They grow out of those archaic developments. And we hope to have more information after our next research seasons that will tie into that particular aspect. Thank you very much. And I hope this was helpful and useful.
Absolutely, Dr. Valdez. Thank you so much for that very insightful and fascinating presentation about the earliest Maya. And we will move on to our next presentation. We have Dr. Shawn Morton and colleagues. Dr. Morton is an anthropological archaeologist with an interest in urban and architectural studies, ritual and religion, survey and visualization, community-engaged approaches, and Mesoamerica and the Caribbean. He co-directs the Stann Creek Regional Archaeological Project in Belize. We are excited to hear more from Dr. Morton and his co-authors, Dr. Peuramaki-Brown and Dr. Jordan, in their presentation on cultural expression and the ancient architecture of the Stann Creek District.
Good morning. My name is Dr. Meaghan Peuramaki-Brown, and this is my co-presenter, Dr. Shawn Morton. We'd like to start by thanking the hardworking directors of Heritage Education Network Belize for putting on this symposium and inviting us to share our research with you.
Today we want to talk about architecture. And while architecture may appear static, changing only slowly from generation to generation, architectural expression stands among the most dynamic of human creations when viewed through the multi-generational lens of archaeology. It's a remarkably flexible medium for cultural expression that reacts to environmental and social and political and economic and ideological and functional and aesthetic pressures. Over the next 15 minutes, we'd like to introduce you to one such cultural expression, the ancient Maya architecture of East Central Belize and the town of Alabama, which rose to regional prominence during the late to terminal Classic period, or about 700 to 900 AD. We'll endeavor to describe the set of rules, that is the cultural blueprint, that the builders of Alabama used in their task, and we'll speculate about how these might have developed. We'll also discuss our various approaches to understanding this development.
Along with our co-author, Dr. Jillian Jordan, we are co-directors of the Stann Creek Regional Archaeology Project, but many hands have conducted this research within the Stann Creek District, particularly men and women of Maya Mopan Village, who we have missed greatly over the past 2 years away from Belize. We hope this presentation reflects our ongoing collaboration with them.
By way of an introduction, the focus of much of our talk today is the ancient town of Alabama, whose original name remains unknown. The ancient inhabitants established this community in what is today East Central Belize, a material culture subregion of the Maya lowlands, part of the eastern frontier of the Maya world, and roughly equivalent to modern-day Stann Creek District. Despite relatively little archaeological investigation in the region, and often grouped with southern Belize or Toledo District, the ancient towns of Stann Creek District shared several standard features. Such features are readily identifiable and collectively differentiate them from other lowland Maya towns and cities. These include locations atop alluvial terraces with less than a day's travel to coastal lagoons and shores along navigable rivers and overland trails, low, large, non-vaulted architecture, the use of alluvial clays in platform construction, large excavation pits delimiting monumental precincts, stone blocks, megalithic slabs, and stele altars made of non-limestone rock, a general lack of written texts, and special context use of imported limestone. Alabama is an archetype for this regional style and was first documented archaeologically in 1976 by Dr. Elizabeth Graham, one of the other speakers at this meeting and a former director of archaeology for Belize. In this presentation, we'll focus on the masonry platforms of the town. A discussion of buildings atop the platforms will have to await another talk, another time.
The downtown core of Alabama consists of 20 major structure platforms, the tallest, Structure 3, measuring about 7.5 meters in height, arranged around 4 plazas with a short causeway and 14 uncarved granite monuments. This downtown zone measures slightly larger than that of Nimli Punit in southern Belize and is only 1/10 the size of what must have been a bustling downtown at the most significant ancient city in Belize, Caracol. The site of Pierce, immediately to the north of Alabama in the Coxcomb Basin, is estimated to be slightly larger, roughly similar in size to Lubantun in southern Belize. Alabama and Pierce are currently the 2 largest documented sites in Stann Creek.
One of the first ways that archaeologists get at culture through architecture is by looking at it as a whole. What types of buildings and spaces are present? How are they arranged? Would this combination of structures and areas seem familiar to someone visiting from another community, and thus speak to similar cultural understandings of how a town should look or feel, or would it seem foreign? Archaeologists can do much of this without ever digging in the ground. Like most archaeological projects, ours devoted a considerable chunk of its early research time to producing a couple of maps to begin answering questions of just this type. Based on the available data from Alabama, it appears that, for the most part, structures in the downtown area were largely single-phase constructions. These single phases suggest that Alabama is unlike towns or cities such as Caye or Lamanai, or a modern place like Belize City, built up over time, the product of multiple visions and changing historical, political, social, and cultural contexts. Places where builders superimposed new constructions and plans over old frameworks, particularly in the increasingly dense downtown zones. Instead, Alabama is akin to Belmopan, built relatively rapidly and presumably according to at least a general plan, with most additions and changes pushing the town out laterally across the landscape and hence preserving the original vision of its planners. In this way, Alabama offers a snapshot of what residents saw as a proper and complete town, or at least the start of one.
Looking at this plan, we can see many expected features that would mark Alabama as Maya, as indeed British colonial architecture identifies Old Creole identity in Belize City, or thatched board houses on stilts proclaim Garifuna culture in Hopkins. Back in the day, a Maya visitor to Alabama's downtown, say from neighboring Toledo, would have recognized the principal platforms for temples and the relatively complex arrangement of the equally prominent residences of Alabama's rulers. Visitors may have desired to hip-check a ball in Alabama's centrally placed ball court, and they certainly would have been familiar with the arrangement of structures around several interconnected plazas. That the houses and fields of commoners surrounded this downtown zone would also have felt more or less correct. But so too, there are differences that may have marked Alabama and its inhabitants as distinct to a visitor, broadcasting her unique character, just as San Ignacio is different from Dangriga. For instance, the orientation of Alabama's downtown is different from many of its neighbors, running east-west, as is also the case at Pierce. This east-west orientation is relatively rare in ancient Belize, where north-south tends to be the norm. We note exceptions at some ancient towns in the Caye district, such as Buena Vista and Pacbitun. We might suggest that Alabama's builders had cultural or historical ties to this region, though this is speculative at best.
The location of Alabama in an alluvial valley bottom would have also stood out, at the same time familiar and foreign to a visitor from contemporary Toledo. Specifically, this valley bottom location stands in sharp contrast to other prominent southern towns and cities, such as Lubantun and Nimli Punut, where residents chose to live on restricted hilltops. The dispersed houses and garden plots stretching across the valley bottom and patchwork of milpas extending into the surrounding hills would have likely felt more familiar to a visitor from the Belize Valley. One of our discipline's most prominent scholars, Eric Thompson, observed that early historical Mopan and Kekchi Maya communities in southern Belize preferred different geographic locations on the landscape, alluvial bottoms versus hilltops respectively, a pattern still observed today. Could it be that we're observing a distinct Maya ethnic group at Alabama, and perhaps in East Central Belize in general, compared to ancient southern Belize?
Other unique details of Alabama's settlement may support this idea. For instance, the spacing and arrangement of households across the valley bottom differ from sites in the Toledo district, or the fact that Alabama households tend to have fewer associated structures, which may suggest different preferences or practices, a different rhythm in daily life compared to neighboring regions. Whereas in many areas, household work was segregated into other distinct structures or locations, so cooking here, sleeping there, crafting over there, at Alabama, residents may have integrated many of their daily activities within a single space. Additionally, extended families may not have been the norm for households, unlike in other regions. These are cultural choices that would have resulted in a distinctly different looking community from other parts of the Maya world. Again, this remains as speculation.
Now, eventually, archaeologists do what archaeologists do best, and that is dig. During excavations, scrap team members were quick to point out other unique features of the architecture at Alabama, and indeed in the region as a whole, related to the material choices and cultural practices associated with construction.
Most people who have visited an ancient Maya site would be familiar with platforms or even superstructures, the actual buildings, temples, palaces, houses that one can walk inside on top of these platforms that were made of white limestone. If you've been particularly observant, you may have even seen small sections of the preserved plaster and paint that once coated these structures. Reconstruction drawings, such as the one on the slide, effectively resurrect these places in all their glory. Suppose you've ever been on an archaeological dig in the Maya world or have visited a site when archaeologists have had excavations going. In that case, you may have noticed that, for the most part, the platforms that surround you were largely solid. While they sometimes contained tombs or spaces for ritual offerings, their primary job was to lift buildings skyward, away from rainy season floodwaters, and for the largest of structures in the downtown zone, into the spotlight where everyone could see them. You may have also recognized that the solid cores of these platforms tend to be composed of rough limestone boulders and marl.
In other words, the ancient Maya built the architecture that we know and love out of limestone. They expressed their cultural practice and construction via their knowledge of working with this material, developed over more than a millennium. But what happens when there is no limestone? How might culture and practice adapt? Alabama and other sites in east central Belize, a region dominated not by limestone but by granites and their derived clays, provide an example. As a result, the builders put many unique cultural features on display. The general form of structures accords with expectations for Maya cultural practices seen elsewhere. The methods of construction were also generally similar. They made use of loose and consolidated construction core deposited by the basket load, sometimes penned in by masonry of uncut stone, in turn faced by cut and trimmed blocks which were plastered over. As was the inclusion of ritual and ceremony in the building process, so we found copal in the construction core common. However, the specific materials used were significantly different. Rather than limestone and marl, the ancient people of Alabama used clays for the cores of their buildings, much of which they excavated from pits immediately surrounding the downtown core or nearby the construction site. In fact, we can even see such features in recent LiDAR imagery from the site of Pierce. They faced their structures with pecked granite derived from nearby stream beds. A study conducted by Miss Virginia Cheong demonstrates that builders shaped granite stones to a relatively consistent size across the site and over time. Lacking limestone to make plaster, it appears that the builders of Alabama used a white clay instead, and we're currently trying to better understand this type of construction. Limestone does make an appearance at the site, used exclusively in unique contexts such as ball court markers, and presumably imported at great expense. This represents a tie to broader Maya traditions elsewhere.
The builders of Alabama were also innovative. During excavations, we occasionally encountered a mortar of clay and what looked like crushed granite between and behind stones. At the 2019 Sakut's Cultural Fair, we enlisted the help of some energetic volunteers to see what it would take to shape granite blocks using quartzite hammerstones. In addition to proving that an individual could shape a single block in just a few hours with enough effort, the experiment produced fine grit and larger chips of stone. Under the microscope, it appears that this byproduct material was the primary component in the previously identified mortar. This use of what might be considered waste from block manufacture suggests a value of sustainable and resourceful practices among ancient builders. The use of mortar may have been a preferred solution for dealing with structural instability associated with seasonal heaving and shrinking in the clay-filled platform, along with strategic interlocking blockwork. Additionally, a switch to primarily rubble core construction, alluvial cobbles and boulders, in platforms and plazas occurs later in the town's history and is likely also a way to deal with platform shifting as well as flooding, a problem still today in Stann Creek, by improving drainage.
Another remarkable feature of Alabama is that these material choices and construction techniques are consistent across socioeconomic divides in the town. Regardless of structure size, They can be found in the humblest of commoner houses to those of the town's rulers. The same culturally defined template seems to have been in use.
In our attempt to get our heads around the particular challenges and solutions of building a Maya town in this region, we have collected physical evidence for construction techniques and material choices from our excavations. However, we also informally chat with people living in the region today, both Maya and non-Maya, observe how they use available materials, and even help out with construction projects when we can. Taking all of this information together, we drew up this little infographic. Bringing us back to the language we used at the start of the presentation, this is a set of instructions, if you will, for building a structure at Alabama and in East Central Belize material culture tradition. It represents our current best guess for describing a broad set of cultural practices behind Alabama's architectural blueprint. It is a model that we will refine as the slow edge of the trowel peels back further details of Alabama's structures. It represents a burgeoning understanding of processes that further experimentation and input from collaborators, colleagues, and the public will help deepen. So thank you very much, Botik, and we look forward to any input that you might have.
That was a great presentation by Drs. Morton, Peuramaki-Brown, and Jordan. We now have our final presentation for this session. Rounding off the session, we have Mr. Kong F. Cheong, who is currently a PhD candidate at American University in Washington, D.C. Since 2006, he has participated in several long-term projects, including the Pacbitun Regional Archaeological Project, Social Archaeology Research Program, and the Belize Valley Archaeological Reconnaissance. Being a part of these projects allowed him the opportunity to survey and excavate both cave and surface archaeological sites like Pacbitun, Minanha, Caves Branch, Batalik, and Ishel. He also conducts research at Bagan in Myanmar, the southeastern US, Mexico, and at Swahili sites in Kenya. His interests include ceramics, archaeomusicology, ancient food and beverage, craft production, and architecture. We will now hear from Mr. Cheong on ancient Maya music making sound instruments from the site of Pacbitun, Belize.
Good morning.
Good morning. I want to thank Heritage Education Network Belize and its director for organizing this KULCHA Symposium, which I find to be delightfully well organized and a much needed outlet for Belizean heritage practitioners to spread and preserve their knowledge. Music and language are universal features of human society. Both of these communication systems involve gestures and body movement. Music is even said to be the language of emotion. Music is meant to be shared. As soon as someone made a sound, that sound is already traveling and thus heard by someone else. As such, the earliest human in what is today the land of Belize must have already been making music. It could be as simple as banging two sticks together. One could make a sound, and then by continuously making that sound in a rhythmic manner, one could be making music. Although we have no evidence of Paleo people making music, we can deduce that they must have been, as music is life. However, percussion, wind instrument, made from perishable materials did not preserve well in the wet and humid environment of Central America. While music instruments made of fire clay, basically ceramic, have been excavated throughout the Maya region, the earliest in the archaeological record are ceramic vessel flutes or ocarinas that were excavated from the site of quail, black man eddy, and baking pot, dating to the Middle Preclassic period. This meant that the ancient Maya of Belize were the earliest to be making music in the entire Maya region. As such, ancient Belizeans have been grooving on music long before everybody else. The kinds of sound-producing instruments used by the ancient Maya can be made from perishable plant materials like gourds, hollow-out logs, and other wooden materials, or they could be made from non-perishable materials like fired clay, bones, shells, and from metal, like copper, particularly copper. Some of the perishable music instruments are turtle shell, which can be banged with a wooden stick, and most likely they use a deer antler as depicted in murals and vases. Bone rasp or rasper is a type of instrument where there are grooves carved on a long bone, typically human, and sometimes human skulls, but also jawbones of deer as well. Sound are produced by running stick across it. So this is a wooden frog, and there's some ridges, groove above it, and this is a stick. I'm gonna show you how it works. So and this is how it looks like on long bones. So they just craft the groove there. Flutes are typically made of long bones as well, or from wooden material like this. This is wood. This is a flute. Rattles can be made from fired clay or gourds with seeds and small pebble placed inside. So this is rattle. On the murals of Bonham Park, we could see depictions of such rattle, as well as trumpets and drums. Trumpets could be made from wooden materials as well, but also typically conch shells, so conch trumpet. I don't have a conch shell. I don't have a conch trumpet, sorry. Whereas drums are typically made from wood with a skin stretched across, forming a sound-producing membrane. In addition to this, the ancient Maya also use ceramic pedestal drum or hand drums that are held by gripping between the person's body and arm, and then use the other hand to bang on it. So you can. This is not a pedestal drum. So another unique instrument is the tungkul. This is a tungkul, or a slit drum, because basically it's a hollow out tree trunk and with slit carving it, and then you hit it with a stick to produce sound. This is actually bamboo. So, like so. Copper bells are also common and perhaps worn on the ankles, and during dancing, the sound is produced. Perhaps they also wear it on their arm, and then when they dance, sound is produced. By far, the largest type of musical instrument artifact in the archaeological records are made of ceramic, like so. These include vessel flute like ocarinas, whistles, tubular duck flutes, drums, bells, rattles, composite type instrument like a tubular vessel flute, rattle hybrid, which have been found at Pacbitun, Belize. Two of them actually. So when I say tubular duck flute, it's just a typical flute. So tubular. And then a vessel flute is usually either an ocarina or whistle. So this is an ocarina. So this body here, the round body, is a resonating chamber. It's also, by definition, a vessel. So a whistle is just the mouthpiece and then an exit hole, and it only produces one note. Sorry. An ocarina has a mouthpiece, an exit hole, and then there's also finger holes, various finger holes, and it produces different notes and sound. Forgot about the whistle rattle hybrid. So at Pacbitun, we have two of these whistle rattle hybrid. So this is the flute part with the finger holes, and then this is the rattle part. So imagine a flute and a rattle hybrid. So you could use it like a wind instrument or shake it like a rattle. Ancient cultures in the Americas use music for both religious and social reasons. This music probably are reinforced with vocal sounds or dancing. Vocal sounds like, singing and dancing. It's likely that the ancient Maya entertained themselves with music. Beyond this realm, however, the ancient Maya may have used music to entertain their gods and deities. Processions are an important part of life among the ancient Maya, especially for the ruling elite. This is because a procession is a moving performance for both the gods and the public. So, the elites have to impress, put on a big show, a nice show for the gods above and for the gods below, and also for the public, for the people. From depiction on vase and murals, we know that the Maya ballgame also involved music and musicians. Ritual auto-sacrifice or self-bloodletting have been depicted with the individual naked, with a perforated penis and blowing a shell trumpet at the same time, perhaps to call on the gods to let the gods know what he is doing. From Pacbitun, we know that music instruments were involved in funerals, as these instruments were possibly used in the funeral procession and then buried with the deceased. Scenes of hunters with music instruments indicate that it is also used in hunting. Usually they are little conch shells, probably some kind of trumpet or whistle. Perhaps they're hunting with dogs. I haven't figured out how to hunt with musical instrument. Stay tuned. Although we only have scenes depicting men with musical instrument, however, at Pacbitun, each of the burials with ocarinas and tubular flute rattle hybrid were that of female individuals. At Aguateca in Guatemala, ocarinas are found in the kitchen storage area, which meant women and children are the most likely users of this instrument. It is worth noting that the scenes from murals and vases are typical of those rituals and of public events, as well as other male-dominated activities like bloodletting and hunting. Soundscape is the totality of all the sound present in a given environment and how they interact within that particular environment. The reconstruction of the soundscape of an ancient city like Pacbitun will depend on a good contextual information in the form of the preservation of architecture, the clear understanding of the internal spatial arrangement of such structures at a given time period, as well as the recovery of music instrument. As these components creates intentionally desired type of sound played by that culture in that location during that time period. At Pacbitun, archaeological investigations have been ongoing for almost 4 decades, which meant that Pacbitun's central precinct is well understood, with all of its 42 structures located and precisely mapped. Additionally, a sizable quantity of music instruments were recovered, As a result, a combination of these factors, the postulation of soundscape at Pacbitun during the late Classic to Terminal Classic period is conceivable. Although the female burials from Pacbitun were all excavated from restricted access courtyards in Pozuela, both of them, both types are domestic, the nature of music is that it can be heard even from behind a hidden courtyard or at a restricted access Pozuela. Music and sound at Pacbitun, though produced in hidden restricted access courtyard and Pozuelas, could still be heard in the public areas of the central precinct. Thus, the soundscape of Pacbitun would have been a mixture of not only music and sound produced during rituals, ceremonies, and procession by elite men blowing trumpets and beating drums, but also music and sound made by elite women using their rattles, ocarinas, flutes in the restricted access courtyard and in their restricted access courtyard in Pozuela, all accompanied by the noises of a busy open-air market in Plaza B, as well as the noises of activities like wood chopping, children playing, a mason's hammer, busily shaping stones for construction. And encompassing all these layers of sound is the ever-present sound of the rainforest, such as the howling from male howler monkeys, the chirping of various species of birds, the rustle of leaves and corn stalks, the pesky sound of mosquitoes, the sound of rainfall, and running water. This is the sound of a vibrant ancient Maya city-state, not unlike the sound at the busy marketplace next to the bus terminal in Belmopan today. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that very sensory, illuminating presentation, Mr. Cheong. Mr. Cheong, sorry. We want to thank the presenters for this first session, and now we are going to move on to our question and answer and discussion session. So I will add our much anticipated presenters. Welcome to all of you. Good morning. First, I just wanted to thank you again very much for your lovely presentations. So much information. We have quite a few comments and questions. I will go in order, I think. So we have Miss Sadie Giron, who asks, let me see, what material were these constricted unifaces? I believe this is probably directed to Professor Valdez. So I'll let you have the floor.
Yeah, the constricted unifaces are made of what we call chert or flint. And in the case of the ones that I'm specifically had been discussing is from this area of northern Belize off the old Northern Highway, which is a chert bearing zone. So they're made of chert or flint, so very hard stone.
Perfect. That's great. We have a lot of love in the comments. Lots of people asking for access to this information after the conference. So I will just remind our viewers that all of these presentations and this live feed will live on our websites, on our Facebook, and on our YouTube. So you can always go back and reference them as you need. And of course, our lovely presenters will be available, I'm sure, to answer questions in the comments after this. If we do see a question directed to them after the live feed is ended, we can always send it to them to get their response and post it in the comments after the fact. We have a question for Dr. Morton and Peuramaki-Brown. So this is from a Miss Castillo. Does the current architecture at Alabama or any other Maya community in Belize still consist of ancient methods in Maya architecture? If not, what could be a reason for this deviation?
Yeah, and I saw, I think Zach has provided some great answers, feedback in there. That's awesome. Yeah, so basically the basic techniques are still there in communities, and anyone who lives in Belize will see sort of traditional houses in Maya communities, places like that. But over time, that's slowly transitioning, and what's changing is the materials that people are using. So, for example, you don't tend to see an earthen platform with a rock face. Oftentimes, people will have a cement floor now for their home, slightly elevated, not necessarily meters tall, because likely there's different reasons why ancient people did that. Or, for example, where we work in Stann Creek, people are slowly replacing wooden posts of their homes with cement posts. And one of the reasons for that is the soil is so acidic that it will degrade the post within about 4 years. And then you have to rebuild your house, replacing those posts. And so it's a lot less expensive in terms of labor and money, time to construct those cement posts, or steel roofs replacing thatched roofs. Again, it's a lot less time consuming and labor consuming to put up a steel roof than a thatch roof, and you're calling on many more hands to help you, right, to put up a thatch roof than a steel roof. But also health reasons as well. That minimizes infestations such as chinch or assassin beetles. So there are reasons for why these things happen, and they are all across the board. They can be completely functional, but they can be cultural as well. So, for example, I've heard many people comment that the more prosperous families in town tend to have more cement buildings in their household compounds and things like that. So, in general, the ideas are there, but the materials are changing. And again, over 20 years in Belize, I've seen that dramatically change in many communities. But that's really important because a lot of people still have the understandings of how ancient peoples in the area would have built, even though, for example, the Maya that we work with are not originally from the Stann Creek district, but there are many common architectural techniques and elements across the Maya world, no matter if people are from one Maya ethnicity or community or another. And so there's a lot of feedback from local people that still know the traditions or remember what their parents' homes or their grandparents' homes were like. And we bring all that in with our understanding of the ancient architecture.
Wonderful. That's great. Yeah, absolutely. And as you mentioned, Mr. Zach Neeson has been answering that question also in the comments if anybody needs a little more clarity. But I think you did great. So we have a next question that I think probably anybody could chime in on, but it's specific to architecture, and it's from Ingwer Seelhoff. Is there any evidence to find an identical personal architectural handwriting at different sites, so that it might be possible that the same architect, the same person was involved, perhaps hired? So I think they're asking about sort of a signature. I don't know if anybody has any insight on this question.
If no one else wants to, I'm happy to jump in.
Sure, go ahead.
I think that the simple answer is no, but it doesn't mean that there weren't architectural specialists, or it doesn't mean that there weren't necessarily planners who again may have had a name and offered their services. We just don't know. That kind of stuff it's not written down, it's not recorded. People aren't signing buildings. With some pottery manufacturer, people have suggested that there are particular hands of the artist that can be seen, where we can get down to, or at least suggesting, a specific artist made this suite of pots. With architecture, it's just not that. How do I say this? Not that unique, right? There's many hands that take part in the process of producing architecture. And architecture tends to, because again, they tend to be buildings that extend past the life of an individual, right? They're things that are added on to and changed over time. any kind of individual, say, signature, architectural signature, it tends to get modified and changed and messed up a bit. We do have regional styles, though, right? Like we can talk about architecture that is of this region or this perhaps ethnicity or this tradition and that tradition and that one over there, right? And again, if you visit different Maya sites, you start feeling ancient Maya sites. You start feeling that difference, seeing that difference in kind of style from place to place to place to place.
Absolutely. Go ahead, Dr. Peuramaki-Brown.
Yeah, I'll just chime in as well from sort of a the house construction perspective. We've been in our own research thinking of that's a really amazing question, because we've been thinking about similar sort of things. Is there a way that we could try to detect maybe not individuals, but groups of individuals that may have been responsible for building stuff together, say in the same location in the town? And what we've been trying to do is Virginia Chiak's work measuring the stones and how they're being shaped, whether we could try to sort of create groups there to perhaps represent different people's practices at shaping those stones, but also where they're accessing granite. And we've had some luck in the Alabama core. If you remember from the presentation, you see where the downtown is. It's covered in tall trees. Then there's orange orchard, and that's where everybody was living around the downtown. And then there's foothills on 3 sides. And we've had some luck at identifying different types or subtypes of granite in different parts of those foothills. And now we're trying to match those areas up with the granite we find in houses. And so perhaps those are different groups accessing different parts of foothills together to build in that way. So that's one way that we can try to narrow it. And then the ultimate way, which we will never be able to do, I don't think, is sometimes when people built their house, they're building the superstructure out of pole and thatch, but they also put mud on the outside, or daub, which is daub or bahareke. And you'll find fingerprints in there every once in a while. And that's super cool. And you want to think, oh, I'm going to find, the same fingerprint in a bunch of buildings. But the chances of us doing that is very rare, especially talking about over hundreds of years of construction. But that's just a really neat little bit of information to totally connect an individual with that place. And it's super rare that we find that archaeologically. So those are just some of the wish lists of one day you want a whole database of ancient fingerprints, and then maybe you could say something like that.
Yes, absolutely. Very fascinating. Great question and great responses. We're running out of time, but we will, I think, ask a question to Mr. Cheong, because we have quite a few, but let me choose one. Miss Nady Novello says, "Good morning. I would like to know in which Belizean archaeological site has the most musical instruments been found?" I don't know if this is something you might know.
I would say.
Oh, we can't quite hear you. I don't know if you're muted. Oh. It says your mic is not connected.
Yeah.
Oh, there we go. Go ahead.
Yeah, it seems these doesn't work.
No problem.
So it seems like Pacbitun will be the most famously known for the musical instrument. It's well published on the subject. But then other sites such as Lubantun also have a lot of musical instruments. But these are normally listed as figurines. So someone need to go back to the collection and really analyze them and figure out which is what. And then baking pot also have a lot of musical instrument. It's just not published and no report was mentioned about it thus far. Maybe someone is interested and they can look into it. But otherwise, Pacbitun in Belize would be very famous for it.
Wonderful. It sounds like a great thesis or dissertation for someone in the future, right? So unfortunately, we're out of time. We do have a few other questions in the comments. So if the presenters are able to, they're more than welcome to go and respond to the questions there. If there's any final words that any of the presenters would like to say, I'd like to open the floor now.
I think I'd just say
Thank you for having us.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you all for being here so much for this first symposia. And we will be back shortly after a 15-minute coffee break for the next session called Post-Contact Belize. We look forward to seeing you there. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.
And my thanks to Heritage Belize for accepting
Welcome back. We hope you enjoyed our first session on ancient Maya archaeology and have taken some time to refresh yourselves before our next session. In keeping with the theme of archaeology, we now have a session discussing post-contact Belize. This session adds to our understanding of the historical period of Belize through an archaeological lens. After 1492, we have been taught that the world became more interconnected and contact was made between various populations across the globe. This so-called contact led to a complex history of social and cultural interactions. Archaeology allows us to gain a unique material perspective of these interactions to understand the lived realities from all subpopulations of society, including those not well represented in the written record. The presentations here do just that by discussing colonial lifeways at Tipu, Lamanai, and San Pedro, as well as heritage in Crooked Tree, the birthplace of Creole culture, through the lens of archaeology. So to begin, we have Professor Elizabeth Graham, who is an archaeologist. Her work has focused on Maya archaeology in Belize. She received her PhD in archaeology from Cambridge University. Her first fieldwork was with Norman Hammond at Nomuel in 1973. She went on to survey archaeological sites in the Stann Creek district for her PhD research, and then served as Belize's archaeological commissioner from 1977 to 1979. During which time she began reconstruction and consolidation work at Xunantunich and Altunha. Since then, she has carried out investigations at Tipu, Lamanai, and most recently on Caye, where she is focusing on the human impact on soils. We will now hear from Professor Graham on Belize's Spanish and British colonial heritage as seen through Tipu and Lamanai. Welcome, Dr. Graham.
My presentation on Belize's early colonial heritage. Greetings and my thanks to Heritage Belize for accepting my presentation on Belize's early colonial heritage as seen through Tipu and Lamanai. On the left, you have a photograph of the church excavations that took place at Tipu in the 1980s. This is the church in the foreground. On the right, you have Lamanai, pretty much as the Lamanai churches as they exist today. They were consolidated in a program directed by Jaime Awe in 2007-2008. This is YDL in the foreground. That's Iglesias de Lamanai Uno, the first church at Lamanai, built right over a post-classic Maya temple, and the second church in the background, the altar end is here, and I call this the capilla or chapel, which was standing for hundreds of years and in fact gave its name to the original area, which was called Indian Church. And then the nave, which was perishable, would have stood here. I know that most of you know the locations of Tipu and Lamanai, but just in case, here they are: Lamanai at the head of the New River, along the New River Lagoon, and Tipu on the Makal River. And these are the names of communities that were in existence at the time of the Spanish conquest in the 1500s, and the names come largely from Spanish documents. On this chronological table, the red arrows point to the periods of time which I refer to in the talk. From 1501 to 1544 is the period that I call the coastal incursions, which were felt more at Lamanai but negligible at Tipu, although I think this probably began a lot earlier, as early as 1492. Soon after Columbus's first voyage to the New World, exploration began throughout the Caribbean. In Belize, the period from 1544 to 1641 is the major period of Spanish colonial activity, and this is what we see at Lamanai and at Tipu. From 1641 to 1708, we see diminished activity by the Spanish authorities and certainly by the religious authorities. And by the 1660s, we can say that the Spanish have pretty much lost interest in the area that we now know as Belize. There are two reasons why I think it's important to recognize that the early explorations of the area that we call Belize were coastal. One is that the Spanish discovered very early on no deep water ports. Therefore, they focused their attention on Honduras and on the Gulf of Mexico and not Belize because they realized there were no ports there. The other is that if I am right, and I think I am, about early, not just early Spanish exploration, but early exploration along the coast by other Europeans, this means that diseases would have hit coastal communities much earlier. And this is what I find at Lamanai, and I'll explain why I think so on the next slide. The other thing is that Lamanai is the only community that shows up on some of these early maps, although it shows up in strange areas. Here it's an island off the coast. Here it's placed on the mainland, and here it's placed on the coast again. But it suggests that the name Lamanai was known to explorers very early on, and probably to the Mayas' disadvantage. Here you have some late pottery from Lamanai. On the left, pottery with a nice red slip that dates between 1300 and 1450s. But on the right are the ceramics. David has called them Iglesias pottery because they occur in the colonial period, but also appear on the site in places that do not have colonial artifacts and appear to be earlier than the time when the Spanish established the encomienda at Lamanai. And although these are rather worn, they originally had a red wash. You can see that there is some, you could say, deterioration of quality. And it does not happen at Tipu, where there is continuity in in the ceramic manufacturing, and we see polychromes even in the colonial period. So it's one reason why I think that Lamanai, its exposure to the coast, meant that the people there may have been destabilized much earlier on than we originally thought by disease. This is a lot of text, but I know that the presentations will be available to you later, so I thought that the text might be helpful, but I will try to summarize here. I mentioned the coastal incursion, greeting, a deep water port which they flew to Honduras through Belize inside the reef with the aid of Maya from the area. And it is on that trip that he dismisses the coast of Belize as being very useful to the Spanish because they're looking for a deep water port which they find in Honduras. 1544 is a key date of the conquest of many of the communities in Belize by Melchor and Alonso Pacheco, who conquered and fought people between Chetumal all the way to Guatemala, and of course this included most of Belize, and their atrocities were considerable. They were reported to the crown in 1548 by a Franciscan friar, but I don't know how much good that did in terms of mitigating any of the atrocities. The communities were then grouped into encomiendas, which are tribute-paying communities, and the encomendero lived in Bacalar, in a villa in Bacalar, and not in Belize itself. The communities then were well, we can't say how stable they were, but in 1546, rebellions broke out both in Yucatan and Belize against these recent conquests. Once the rebellions were put down, the period from 1550s to 1600s was one of relative stability in Belize communities. This is the time when building was expanded. At Lamanai, the second church was built, and at Tipu, the community size increased as well, and the church was kept in a fairly good state. Now, both Tipu and Lamanai were considered reduction communities, and that means that people in smaller villages around the outside were moved by the Spaniards into these communities to keep them under control. Major rebellions took place in 1639 to 41. This was a very important point in Belize history because this is when the Spanish were pretty much driven from Belize. Tipu and Lamanai played a large part in these rebellions. The Tipuans are said to have been in cahoots with the Itza Maya from Petén, who, as you may know, were not Christianized. Lamaneros burnt the church at this time, and as far as we know, it was not rebuilt. So the Spanish lost their foothold and their interest. From 1641 to 1700, then we see a diminution of Spanish activity in Belize. Lamanai seems to remain rather problematic and rather peripheral at this time, peripheral to Spanish authorities, that is. But Tipu curiously stays in communication with church authorities in Merida and maintains the local church until the time of the conquest of the Itza Maya in 1697. Then, a little after 1700, the people from Tipu are moved to Peten, and this is so that the Spanish can have greater control because they are no longer active in Belize. It is stated in the documents that the Tipuans periodically left Peten to return to Belize, but once there, they were repeatedly attacked by forces of the Mosquito and the British, who would take them as slaves. So they were caught between a rock and a hard place. And there's some archaeological evidence that Tipuans returned on occasion to the site of their former town. Now, Lamanai is interesting because there is some indication that communities continued in the area until the 20th century, when the Belize Estate and Produce Company forced 2 villages to move to near Orange Walk. This is the church at Tipu. You can see here this is the east or altar end, steps leading up to where the altar would have been. It was a portable altar. I'll talk about that in a minute. Little room at the back where church paraphernalia was kept. Nave of the church where people were buried, and also buried on the north, west, and south sides, but not on the east end. And this is a reconstruction of part of the community, the buildings that we had excavated. I included all these notes because this was an early reconstruction and unfortunately left out too much information. So if you're interested, you can see the platform that was originally, the artist drew very small, is actually much larger. There were actually 2 buildings here rather than 1. The church looks pretty good, but there was another building found as well here by Ranju Song. So this might give you a better idea of the community itself and the post-classic buildings in the background. This should give you a better idea of what the original church at Tipu looked like. It's a reconstruction drawing by Louise Bélanger and Claude Bélanger. You can see all of this is based on archaeological evidence, including the substantial wall that separated the altar area from the sacristy. It was a partial height wall. There was only a place for the altar because it turns out they used portable altars that the priest or the friar would bring when he came to the community for part of the year to say Mass. These are photographs of some of the excavations at Lamanai. These 2 were taken when my husband, David Pendergast, was excavating there in the 1970s, and this is a bit later when I was responsible for some of the work around the church. Here you can see the post-classic temple that was knocked down to make way for the church, as well as the steps, very like Tipu, leading up to the place where the portable altar was placed, sacristy behind. This is a photograph of some of the burials from beneath the nave floor of the church. The burials in the 1500s and 1600s, the individuals had their heads on the west facing east, but there are interments where individuals have their heads to the east facing west, and I'll explain these in a minute. This is a photograph of the area just north of the chapel of the second church, and this is the rectory, or the remains of the building where the traveling priest or friar stayed when he ministered to the community. This stela in place here was in place for many, many years, and it was probably erected at the time of the rebellions, if not later, in the nave of the second church. More reconstruction drawings to give you a better idea of what the churches at Lamanai looked like. The first church, which was built on a pre-Columbian style platform, which is interesting because that practice is abandoned quite early on. It was partial height wall like the Tipu church, and it had the same area where the portable altar was placed, and a little room in the back called the sacristy. The atrio, which I mentioned before, is where the religious, either priests or friars, either preached or taught a catechism or doctrine to the members of the community. This is a reconstruction of the second church. Much of this was standing for many hundreds of years, and as I said, gave the name to Indian Church. We added this copying similar churches of a similar period in Yucatan. The nave placement was discovered really by Claude Belanger and Jorge Kahn in the year that Jaime had the consolidation and conservation project. They discovered the post holes for the nave, so we were there and also here, so we were able to reconstruct the size of the nave, and they discovered also this small platform that may have supported a baptismal font. Here we have examples of very interesting effigies that date to the colonial period, and they are interesting because they show continuity with a Maya tradition or pattern that is known from classic times, in which you have a human head emerging from the mouth of a crocodilian or a saurian creature. In these cases at Lamanai, and I think this might be true at Santa Rita as well, these effigies are often combinations of creatures, and often of a land creature and of a creature associated with the water. And they occur at Lamanai in the areas of the church, which suggests to me that the Maya are carrying on cultural traditions of importance to them, but are taking on these sacred spaces, Christian sacred spaces, as their own, rather than seen as an affront to Christianity, which is how they were interpreted in the documents by both Spanish authorities and Spanish religious friars or priests. Here we have some artifacts from Tipu, an example of the ceramics, and I mentioned that the ceramics at Tipu, the traditional practices seem to have continued, whereas at Lamanai we do see some deterioration. There were many bells, copper bells found at Tipu, also at Lamanai, as there was a lively trade in copper bells in both the very late post-classic and colonial period. This is a censer in European style. Called, in Europe it would have been called a thurible, but it was made at Tipu, and it was found in the nave of the church in the grave of an adolescent, and it was used to burn incense and would have been swung by someone in the church. This is a little masquette that came from a very late period house, I think 17th century most likely, but it was cached on the midline in pre-Columbian style. I consulted with Carl Tauber, who said that if I remember correctly, it's either the fat god or the wind god, but it is interesting that a pre-Columbian style artifact would have been cached along the midline of a Spanish period house. We also found olive jars at both sites. Here, this broken olive jar is from a residence next to the church. Spanish mayolica was found in the walls of the church at Tipu, which suggested to me that the church was refurbished and continued over time and incorporated some of the material that was coming into the local community. This vessel is from the residence next to the church, and interestingly, it's in the style of a Lamanai vessel. This particular structure is late 17th century, and I'm not sure whether it was brought from Lamanai or made in the community, because we have not done petrography on the vessel, but it does show some kind level of communication between people from Tipu and Lamanai, and we know from the documents that people from northern Belize often left that area to go to Tipu to get farther away from Spanish authorities. And this little face and this vessel there, this is a fragment of an incense burner. This is an incense burner, and this is what we see in the late period at Tipu, which I think may represent those Tipuans who had been moved to Peten, who came back periodically and lit incense in incense burners in honor of their community. Thank you.
That was a great presentation by Dr. Graham. Thank you so much for helping to contextualize the movements of people, resistance to colonialism, and cultural fusion and resilience that occurred during the historic period. Such fruitful information for Belizeans to gain an understanding of the history of the region. Next up, we have Dr. Mayfield, who is a lecturer at the University of Southern California. She is an anthropological archaeologist and teaching professor with research specializations in historical archaeology, zooarchaeology, ceramics, and ethnography. Dr. Mayfield is the principal investigator of the Old Providence and Santa Catalina Island, Colombia Archaeological Project, and co-director of the San Pedro Ambergris Caye, Belize Archaeological Project, both of which include experimental education and directed research opportunities for undergraduate and graduate students. Her current research centers on colonial period island and coastal settlements in the Western Caribbean from the Yucatan to South America along the Mosquito Coast and aims to identify the effects of rapidly fluctuating military and administrative power structures on the movement and organization of materials, ideas, and built environments during the colonial period, and how diverse yet connected culture histories inform the structures of everyday life for the groups and individuals who currently inhabit these locations. We will now hear from Dr. Mayfield and her co-author, Dr. Simmons, in their presentation From the Canopy to the Caye, Two of Britain's Colonial Ventures in 19th Century Belize.
Good day to everyone. My name is Tracie Mayfield, and I am an archaeologist at the University of Southern California in Los Angeles, and I have been working with Belize archaeology since 2009. Today I will be presenting on two colonial period settlements at Lamanai and San Pedro, Belize, but first, thank you to Heritage Education Network Belize for holding this seminar. Having the opportunity to hear from a wide range of heritage stakeholders on a variety of foci is an incredible opportunity for us all, and I value the time we have together this week. So to begin, during the 19th century, Latin America and the wider Caribbean was a hotbed of trade and commerce driven principally by extractive industries such as agriculture, principally sugar but not solely, and hardwood collection. Such ventures required large injections of capital into the creation and maintenance of productive landscapes, and also into specialized infrastructure used for housing and feeding of workers who provided labor and management for these ventures, which in turn created archaeological contexts that can give us insight into the day-to-day lives of the people who were active in these spaces in the past. During the 18th and 19th centuries, British colonists established settlements at two Belizean sites, which will be presented here today. At Lamanai, an inland forest site, which is located in what is now the Orange Walk district of northwestern Belize, to plant sugarcane and harvest logwood and mahogany, and at San Pedro town, located off the coast of Belize on Ambergris Caye, to cultivate a coconut plantation. Today's presentation utilizes data collected at Lamanai over the past 40 years, along with new materials excavated at Lamanai in 2014 and at San Pedro town in 2017. I will compare and contrast these two sites, situated in very different environmental, culture, and economic landscapes, but also within the broader colonial industrial complex. And please note that while both sites had long-term complex Maya occupations, due to the time restraints, I will only be discussing the 18th and 19th century settlements today. Along with cooking, storing, and serving vessels, fresh beef, chicken, and pork, and bottled, canned, and barreled products such as soda water, salted pork, condiments, and potted meat were consumed in great quantities at both sites. The colonial period residents of Lamanai and San Pedro town were also active consumers of tobacco, bottled medicines, health and hygiene products, for example, chamber pots, tools, and wearable objects such as buttons and boot heels. Lamanai, or Indian Church as it was known in the 19th century, is located in the Orange Walk district of northwestern Belize. It is a lowland, broad-leaved, subtropical inland forest site situated on the western shore of New River Lagoon. The site has moist, shallow limestone soils and has likely been impacted by flooding frequently in its long residential history. This map covers the majority of the Lamanai-built landscape, which is mostly Maya features. The red box represents the main boundaries of the colonial period settlement and its structures, which are of both Spanish and British origin, but only the British period material assemblage will be discussed today. In the early 19th century, British colonists established a sugar plantation at Lamanai, which had long been and continued to be long after the demise of the sugar venture, an area exploited for logwood and mahogany. No formal records of British occupation exist until 1837, when 200 acres were given to the British under the Indian Church Plantation Grant in order to plant sugarcane and build a sugar mill at the site. While sugarcane may have been planted soon after the original grant, the mill itself was not in operation until at least 1866, which is the date on the mill ironworks. The last known documented occupants of the British plantation at Lamanai during the 19th century were soldiers stationed at the site in 1868, although the archaeological records suggest that people continued to live on the site in varying numbers over time, which continues to this day. This is a small sampling of the colonial period artifacts recovered at Lamanai. The majority of the recovered artifacts and materials are related to everyday practices, such as eating, drinking, taking medicine, and smoking. San Pedro is located on Ambergris Caye, the northernmost offshore barrier island along the coast of Belize. The island is 39 kilometers long and no wider than 4 kilometers at any point, and it lies just west of the barrier reef, the longest continuous coral structure in the Western Hemisphere and the second longest barrier reef in the world. A large variety of fish and shellfish species native to the barrier reef were exploited by the ancient Maya. Those resources were also utilized by colonial entities and are still sought to this day. Early occupation of San Pedro town began when ownership rights of the island claimed by the von Olaffen family via squatters' rights around 1850. The caste wars hampered development in the mid-19th century, but sustained occupation and steady population growth was resumed after 1855. San Pedro town is first mentioned in historical documents in 1850, and after a series of owners and subsequent bankruptcies, the Blake family purchased the island in 1869 and started a coconut plantation. The lands were distributed between British families who had fled the caste wars, which began a period of construction and increased permanent settlement. Sustained settlement has continued to this day. This is a small sampling of the colonial period artifacts recovered at San Pedro town, which, as you can see, is similar to the assemblage from Lamanai. The majority of recovered artifacts and materials are related to everyday practices, such as eating, drinking, taking medicine, and smoking. But of note here, these artifacts are from a single level of a 3x3 meter archaeological unit, which contained a mixture of both Maya and British artifacts due to the constant up and down movement of sandy beach soils over time. I also wanted to show you some samples of faunal remains covered at the San Pedro town site. There is excellent bone preservation here as compared with specimens collected at Lamanai, where the soil is considerably more acidic, which I will discuss further in a moment. The San Pedro town artifact assemblage consists of 4,693 objects and dates from approximately 1720 through present day. The mean occupation date is 1893. The bulk of the artifacts were produced post-1840 and before 1890, although some ceramic wares, for example whiteware, are still produced today, which impacts the tenacity of dating formula outcomes and can skew median occupations later in time than was actually the case. To this end, the San Pedro town site mean occupation date utilizes known production dates of ceramics, glass, and nails, while the Lamanai mean occupation date was based on ceramic technologies only. While only one feature, a tabby wall, was recovered at the San Pedro town site, the artifact dates are consistent with the late colonial history of Ambergris Caye, and the ceramic data, detailed further in a moment, along with the high volume and variety of alcoholic beverage containers, soda bottles, and medicines, and a low percentage of construction materials and architectural objects, suggests that at some point during the second half of the 19th century, there was a restaurant or boarding house on or near the property, and not a single family home that utilized the space for trash disposal. Alternatively, the space may have served as a general disposal area for multiple dwellings and or businesses post-1830. At Lamanai, the artifact assemblage consists of 4,765 objects and dates from approximately 1775 through present day. The mean occupation date was 1854, based on ceramic dates of production. The Lamanai assemblage and built environment, which includes a sugar mill, labor and supervisors housing, and churches, suggests that while the number of people living and working at the site fluctuated over time, there has been continuous occupation of the site from the formation of the British colony to the present. At San Pedro town, the bulk of recovered materials were related to foodway activities. For example, food storage, preparation, and serving vessels, and this includes bottles, cans, and other object forms. Along with personal items and construction, household, health and hygiene, and architectural materials make up the remaining portion of the assemblage. At Lamanai, similar to the pattern seen at the San Pedro town site, the bulk of the Lamanai assemblage was also related to foodways. At Lamanai, ceramic objects made up 21.2% of the total site assemblage. 11 distinct ceramic ware types were recovered, the bulk of which were whiteware, pearlware, and banded slipwares. At San Pedro town, ceramic objects made up 31.2% of the total site assemblage. 13 ware types were recovered, the bulk of which were whitewares manufactured post-1830. The large percentage of whiteware also suggests a restaurant or boarding house present at the site during the 19th century. Utilizing heavy-bodied whitewares that would stand up to repeated use by guests over time would be a good financial decision as compared with more expensive, less robust wares that would break more readily. While the number of ware types are similar between the sites, the amount of pearlware at Lamanai suggests an early, sparsely populated settlement which grew over time, as whiteware for the most part displaced pearlware in the first quarter of the 19th century. And the small amount of wares other than whitewares at San Pedro town suggests more of a quick population explosion around the mid-19th century. At Lamanai, 15 unique ceramic object forms were identified. The highest frequency forms were bowls, plates, teacups, and saucers. Of note, very few smoking pipe fragments were recovered at Lamanai. At San Pedro town, 22 unique ceramic object forms were identified. The highest frequency forms, similar to Lamanai, were plates, bowls, saucers, and teacups, but 143 smoking pipes were recovered, which is 14.2% of the total ceramic assemblage. Interestingly, chamber pots made up the fifth most frequent object form, 4.6% in the San Pedro town assemblage. The large number of chamber pots and the wide variety of forms, both ceramic and glass, which will not be covered in this presentation, again suggests not a single family household, but rather a boarding house or communal dump was located on the property in the mid to late 19th century. At Lamanai, 12 decoration types were identified, although that number is higher if each individual color is counted. For example, 8 different transfer print colors. The most frequent decoration types were transfer printed, glazed, banded, and sponged. At San Pedro town, 22 ceramic decoration types were identified, although, again, that number is higher if each individual color is counted. The most frequent decoration types were glazed, transfer print, floral painted underglaze, banded, and sponged. Again here, the sheer number of different decoration types at San Pedro town suggests either multiple households or a restaurant or boarding facility, as opposed to a single-family home, because a restaurant or boarding house would frequently buy new wares to replace broken or chipped items due to repeated use by a large number of people, resulting in a more variable material record. At San Pedro town, 46 distinct taxonomic identifications were noted in the assemblage. Wild specimens made up 67% of the total identified faunal assemblage, and domestic specimens account for 16.5%. A large wild fauna percentage is expected from an island or coastal site due to the majority of meat food being harvested from abundant marine environments. At Lamanai, wild specimens make up 74% of the total identified faunal assemblage, and domestic specimens account for 8.5%. 26 taxonomic identifications were noted in the assemblage, and a large wild fauna percentage is expected from a forested site located on a large lagoon, such as Lamanai. It must be noted here that salted pork may have contributed to consumptive biomass after colonial contact, but those taxa do not leave a significant trace in the faunal record. A large number of metal barrel straps were recovered during the 2017 excavations, but the contents of those wooden barrels are currently unknown. Lastly, I wanted to mention here that a major difference between the material assemblages at San Pedro Town and Lamanai is the state of preservation. At Lamanai has very acidic soil, which you can clearly see makes a difference. The photos here represent similar artifacts and faunal specimens from the mid-1800s, but the San Pedro Town artifacts at the top are so well preserved they look like they could have been used yesterday. And the faunal specimens from San Pedro Town are also extremely well preserved. Notably, even though both sites were located near major marine resources, only a few fishbone fragments were recovered at Lamanai due to bone composition from highly acidic soil, as compared with the San Pedro Town site, where we recovered hundreds of fish specimens. Clearly, the residents of Lamanai would have been eating fish, but there is little evidence of these activities preserved in the archaeological record. In conclusion, during the 19th century, the settlements at San Pedro Town and Lamanai were similar to one another in many respects. At both locations, as is standard at most colonial period sites where people both lived and worked, the most prevalent objects recovered during archaeological excavations were materials related to foodways and consumptive practices. Personal items at both sites made up less than 5% of the total assemblages, suggesting temporary, seasonal, or transient living conditions, which coincides with the known histories and landscape use of the 19th century occupants. While there are many similarities between the sites, there are also key differences, the most obvious being the natural environment and socioeconomic activities. Lamanai, an inland forested site situated on a major river, was a sugar plantation and hardwood extraction resource, and while San Pedro Town, a reef-protected island port location, was a coconut plantation for a period of time, it has also been an important port of trade for the majority of its human settlement. Another key difference between the site assemblages is the variety of ceramics, specifically forms and decoration at the San Pedro Town site compared to Lamanai. Lastly, although 19th century residents at both sites were consuming both wild and domestic meat foods, there was a great deal more variety present at the San Pedro Town site, although this may be due to acidic soils and also due to the use of salted pork and other barreled meats as well. In closing, the key differences between the San Pedro Town sites and Lamanai are natural variety, our natural environment and preservation, use of space, amount of space, and the material and faunal variety. Material and faunal variation may be due to the accessibility of San Pedro as compared to Lamanai, although riverine travel was and continues to be common, so the lack of variation at Lamanai may ultimately be due to different drivers such as economics. Clearly, additional data are needed before more precise interpretations can be made, but site-level analysis has elucidated clear behavioral variability between the 19th century, in the 19th century between Lamanai and San Pedro Town. And that concludes today's presentation. Thank you so much for the opportunity to talk about archaeology at Lamanai and San Pedro Town. Please feel free to contact me if you have any questions or comments.
Great. Just okay. Thank you, Drs. Mayfield and Simmons, for further contextualizing the historical period of this region we now lovingly know as Belize. A great compliment to Dr. Graham's presentation. To round out our morning session, we have experts from the Belize River East Archaeology, a project directed by Dr. Eleanor Ellie Harrison Buck. Dr. Harrison Buck is an archaeologist who teaches at the University of New Hampshire and has worked in Belize for nearly 30 years. Dr. Adam Kading is a senior archaeologist at the 106 Group in Minnesota and leads the historical archaeology for BRIA. The BRIA project results are featured in the Crooked Tree Museum and Cultural Heritage Center, which opened in 2018. Ellie developed the museum in partnership with the local community, along with collaborator Dr. Sarah Clark de Reza, who is a museum education specialist and professor at Washington College. We will now hear from Drs. Harrison Buck, Clark DeReza, and Caye on Creole Culture, heritage-oriented archaeology, and the collaborative development of a community museum in Crooked Tree, Belize. Welcome.
And I want to thank the organizers of the Belize Heritage Education Network for their invitation to be part of this great symposium. Today we plan to talk about the historical component of our archaeological project in Belize and also the collaborative development of a community museum in Crooked Tree, Belize. This slide shows the extent of the Belize River East Archaeology Study Area. It's here in gray. And my project area here encompasses the lower half of the Belize River watershed, so extends basically between Belmopan and Belize City. Initially when I started the Brea project 10 years ago, I admit my initial goal was, like most archaeologists in Belize, to simply document the ancient Maya settlement in this area. However, it quickly became apparent to our team that in addition to a whole bunch of ancient Maya sites, there was also a wealth of colonial sites in the lower half of the Belize River watershed. And fortunately for us, my co-author and Brea team member, Dr. Adam Keating, is a historical archaeology specialist. So over the last decade, the Brea project has turned our attention to recording the historical archaeology in this area, and specifically the Creole history, which in Belize has remained largely undocumented archaeologically. And as most of you know, the Creole are descendants of European and enslaved Africans who were originally brought to Belize by the British to work in the logging industry during the 17th and 18th centuries. And many of the lower Belize River watershed is often referred to as the birthplace of Creole culture. And many of the historic communities, including Crooked Tree, located right here, were originally established as logging camps, and most today are comprised of direct descendants of mixed African and European descent. Notably, many of the rural communities in this area show signs of dwindling populations as, in some cases, some communities have been abandoned altogether as young people move to be closer to the cities and the highways. For instance, all of these Creole communities here in the middle reaches of the river valley between Mount Pleasant and Coquericotte, where we've conducted archaeological survey. None of these villages exist today, with the exception of More Tomorrow here, which, like Crooked Tree, is considered one of the oldest Creole communities in the country. So an overarching goal of the Brea project has been to document and promote this rich history, specifically the Creole history, whose culture remains largely undocumented archaeologically, and is to some extent at risk of being erased. As a result, community-engaged archaeology has become a central part of the Belize River East Archaeology Project. And here, our Brea archaeological excavations have been directly informed by local community members who provided us with valuable oral histories about the area, specifically around Crooked Tree, and directed us to locations in the village where, indeed, we found archaeological evidence for the earliest historical occupation. Local community members are serving not only as our guides and our teachers in their history, but they've also helped us in the excavations themselves. Many were already trained from working on past archaeological projects, including the excavations at Chow Heesh, Maya site, which was directed by Dr. Ann Pyburn some years ago, and others were trained in archaeological field methods by our Brea team. And so here we're going to talk more about the results of our community engaged project, beginning with a discussion of our excavations around the village of Crooked Tree, and then talk about how the results of the Brea project are the feature of a community archaeology museum in the village of Crooked Tree. It was specifically selected as a site for this museum and learning center because the community holds this really valuable repository of colonial archaeology, and the community members also hold this wealth of local knowledge in the form of oral histories. And I developed the Crooked Tree Museum in partnership with the local community, but I also relied, I should mention, on my amazing collaborator, Dr. Sarah Clark DeReza, who's also a co-author on this paper. And she's a specialist in museum education, and she's also a professor at Washington College. Now, the museum presents the deep history of human-environment interactions in the lower Belize River watershed. So this spans as much as 10,000 years of continuous human occupation. So from Paleo-Indian times through the ancient Maya and into the colonial period, which is really the feature of the museum, this rich colonial history involving the Creole people who still live in this area today. Now, most of our historical investigations in and around Crooked Tree have focused on an area around the Baptist church in the village, which the site itself dates to a period in the 19th century following the abolition of slavery in 1838. This period often referred to as the post-emancipation society. Locals informed us that this location marked the earliest village occupation and that it was founded by two brothers, William and George Tillett, who were first-generation Creole and whose descendants actually still live in the village today. And one of the buildings, this one right here, it was originally built in 1835, and it served as the original Baptist church and also the first school in the village. And here it's being shown, here you can see it actually being used as a school in the 1940s. And our investigations were guided by a combination of sources, including the stories of village elders who actually remember attending the school as children, and also this historical map that you can see here from 1868 that we recovered from the Belize National Archives. And I'm going to come back to this shortly, but we were given permission to excavate this area by the village chairman, as well as the pastor of the Baptist church. Now, the Brea team developed a strategy to investigate the archaeology, employing several different methodologies designed to investigate specific areas of the churchyard and the area surrounding, right, what is the modern church, and then also this historic building that I mentioned previously. We carried out a series of shovel test pits, STPs, that you can see demarcated here in this aerial image, and also some larger test excavations with sort of broader horizontal exposure of certain areas where we found high densities of artifacts. A member of the Brea team, Lori Phillips, she developed a series of heat maps that you can see here highlighting artifact densities. And although shovel test pitting does not tell you how things change through time, they are particularly well suited to help identify the horizontal distribution of artifacts across the site. So it tells you which areas contain higher or lower densities of artifacts, and they show you the different kinds of artifacts that are distributed across the site here. So for instance, this is a distribution of the historic ceramics that we found. This is the distribution of the historical glass. This is the distribution of historical metal. And this is the distribution of pipe fragments. While the pipes were actually our latest artifact class, we couldn't help but notice the clustered distribution right outside of the church here. And when I asked the pastor actually about the smoking habits of the 19th century parishioners, he clarified to me that it was probably the neighbors who threw those pipes over the fence. So. All right, so we compared what we were finding archaeologically with the 1868 map. And this tall structure right here, and of course, as I mentioned, was the original church and school. We believe that's what's shown in the map here, the high stilted structure. And that it was two stories actually, originally, and later blew down. The top story blew down during the 1931 hurricane. It was re-erected and then it eventually positioned where it is today, but roughly in the same location. And this also, in relation to some of the old roads we can see in the map and also today. We started to look in other areas here and found what we believe is this structure, which may represent the house of William Tillett. The relative location of these two buildings also aligns what we found archaeologically. And we wondered then, what would this area represent here, where we see these two structures here? And when we asked locals, what do you recall was over there? Their answer was the outhouses, where they also said they used to dump trash, which for historical archaeologists, right, we're thinking, ding, 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 this is great. A gold mine. Outhouses, also known as privies, often provide some of the most useful information because after they get filled up, they then are turned into often trash dumps and they get sealed over with refuse. So sure enough, when we look at our heat map, right, it lit up in this area with a spike in artifact densities. And we can see on the ground surface multiple pairs of depression that really indicate, right, we're dealing with outhouses. And so we decided to open up this area, an excavation here, up 37 in this location, and found beautifully preserved barrel-lined privies, one filled with trash from the late 1800s. And so during our excavation season, we held an open archaeology day at the site and invited members of the community to come and visit, ask questions, see what we were uncovering. in the excavations, and teachers actually brought all of their students. We had 78 students ages 7 to 14 come over on a walking field trip from the Crooked Tree School, and we showed them the excavations, shared with them the artifacts we were finding, talked about how we do archaeology. And when we brought them there over to the privy, there was certainly a lot of curiosity, a lot of questions. And we say, if they didn't think we were weird already, this kind of sealed the deal for these guys. But they're excavating what? They asked. So you can see here Brea project members trying to explain the rationale for excavating a toilet to one of the elders here from the community who came for a tour. This gentleman's actually in his 80s, and he not only attended the school as a child, but is a direct descendant of William Tillett. So he actually still speaks with a slight Scottish brogue. So it's in our conversations with these elders, right? We hear about we can hear their European ancestry there for sure. And we also hear their stories of what they remember about attending the Baptist church school as young children. They describe the different kinds of writing implements they used to use. They mention using slate and chalk as young children, and as they got older, they moved to the classroom on the second floor of the school where they got to use inkwells and quill pens. So in our excavations, we indeed found fragments of such implements and a large number of slate fragments, such as the examples shown here. We also found toys indicative of children, such as these doll parts and marbles. And actually, elders recalled to us playing marbles as a kind of a memorable pastime here. And we can also see we found on the last day of excavations this iron cross in our excavations. So letting us know that there was certainly long-term presence of a church in this location. And we also found many different kinds of decorated plates, bowls, mugs, and the kinds of serving wares, right, that villagers used to serve up their meals on. We also found the bones from those animals that made up some of those meals. And in a lot of ways, Crooked Tree in the 19th century was an isolated community. It was located far from any cities out in what was then the remote frontier of the former British colony. There was no road to the island, to Crooked Tree. Crooked Tree, if you don't know, is an island. And it wasn't until 1983 that there was a bridge built there. So boat was really the only way in. And yet we see in these artifacts that the people in Crooked Tree were still incorporated into the wider global community, lining their tables with these ceramics and glassware that was made in Europe. And this is really the same is true of the large collection of imported pipe bowls. As you can see here, some pipe stems to smoke tobacco, likely brought in from elsewhere. So these artifacts, along with this large amount of glassware from wine and liquor bottles, help tell us that, it wasn't all church and school taking place here in the center of town, and aligns with the oral histories and ethnohistoric accounts that describe this place as a small village in the 1840s, what was formerly called Tilliton. You might have seen that label on many of these slides, right? But of course, that name didn't stick. We know it today as Crooked Tree. So the museum's successful development was really contingent on public participation. Our starting point was asking the local Creole community to share their history and to ask them what it was they wanted to learn about in terms of their own history. Our archaeological investigations were guided by local community members who not only provided us with a wealth of valuable oral histories about the area, they guided us on the placement of our excavations, right? And additionally, local villagers trained in archaeological field methods were instrumental in the excavations themselves. So in all these ways, the archaeology was really a collaborative, what we would call a collaborative heritage-oriented project, wherein collective social memory really serves to empower local descendant communities in accessing their own past. In other words, we weren't the experts on this past, they were. And in addition to the artifacts from our excavations, I should add that numerous historical objects were donated by local community members alongside their stories, which together serve to inform the historical reconstructions that are presented in the museum. And the local community was really involved each and every step of the way in the building of this museum, beginning with the donation of the structure in the center of the village that houses the museum exhibition today. The museum itself was designed by a local architect from the village, and we hired local contractors, builders, technicians, and artists to assist in the overhaul of the museum building and in the design of the exhibition. And we were certainly grateful for the continuous support of Niche, including the director of the IA, Dr. John Morris, shown here, who was our keynote speaker for the opening in June of 2018. This day was really a huge success, not only because hundreds attended this celebration, but because people, young and old, engaged with one another and shared in their rich history. And for the long-term success of the museum, we know having engaged and committed stakeholders is really key. The Village Council is who runs the museum today, and our community partners also include local teachers who help shape the exhibit displays and corresponding educational content. And a year after the opening of the museum, my education collaborator, Dr. Sarah Clark-DeReza, and I co-organized with the Banquitas House of Culture, a teacher workshop and educational training that was accredited actually by the Ministry of Education. And the aim was to encourage teachers across the country to integrate the exhibition and curriculum design into their classroom curricula. And the workshop really was a great success and a lot of fun. And before COVID, we were planning another workshop for the following year that would integrate both teachers and tour guides. So we're hoping to reinstitute the workshop post-pandemic. So I'll conclude by making a final plug for the museum and a shout out to all the teachers and tour guides out there. If you're interested in a future workshop opportunity and or tour of the museum in Crooked Tree, please contact the museum. Here's our Facebook page. And be sure to check out our virtual tour. I'll share a link to that in the live chat. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you, Drs. Harrison Buck, Clark-DeReza, and Kading for that great presentation, adding to our adding the voice of Creole culture to our understanding of the past. Amazing work. And just a quick note that I did provide the links to more information about the museum and their very amazing work in the chat section. So you should be able to see those links directly in the chat. So without further ado, we will now move on to the live Q&A. We welcome all of our amazing presenters. I'm just going to add them all to the stream real quick. Welcome, and thank you all so much for being here. So a lot of information I think that a lot of Belizeans don't usually get access to on a daily basis. So thank you so much for being here and being willing to present it. So we have a few questions in the comments. I think I will start with this one from Miss Villarreal. Do you think the unique history of Crooked Tree led to such a strong foundation for this collaborative project? Or do you think this blueprint could work across Belize? That's a great question. I'm interested to know what you think.
Sure. Well, thanks for having us here. This has been great. I think that certainly Crooked Tree, as I noted, is considered one of the oldest Creole communities in Belize, but certainly I also mentioned More Tomorrow is another one of the oldest as well communities. So I certainly think this history extends beyond just Crooked Tree, and I think we could see this, if not duplicated, but certainly emulated in other places to celebrate not only the Creole history, but also the other rich histories within Belize for sure.
Absolutely. Wonderful. And I hope to see more and more of this. You guys are doing great work. So we have another question from one of our viewers, and it's a little heavy, but I think we can address it. I will open it up to any of the presenters if they want. It's addressed to Dr. Graham, but I think it's general. They are interested in understanding the role of Christianity as a tool in oppression and brainwashing of both Maya and African ancestors, and why it's still such an element of control in our society. Why have we embraced such a lethal weapon used against us for centuries? In other words, why has Christianity been so effective in brainwashing us? Would you attribute some of it to syncretization? Like I said, a very heavy question, but if anybody has any comments or thoughts on it, we would welcome them.
Well, should I try to answer it or?
Sure, if you're comfortable, go ahead.
Sure. I don't think it was so effective in brainwashing Maya communities, because if you look at the details, they appropriated what they wanted to appropriate and integrated it with local beliefs. So, in fact, what they did was what the original Christians did when the original proselytizers passed through Europe. And, for example, the customs like sign of the cross and holy water and all that stuff, Jesus never said anything about that. Mm-hmm. Those are all indigenous European customs that you can trace to different ethnic groups, Germanic tribes, tribes in Spain. And so as, sort of this Christian movement traveled across Europe, local people just continued to do what they did and adopted some of the messages of Christianity. And that's really, what the Maya did in Belize. So I'm not sure that we should look at it entirely as brainwashing and more as appropriation, but I don't know what you think.
Absolutely. I think it's important to see it as sort of a means of resilience and adaptation. And you're absolutely correct that a lot of the traditions we might see as Christian today were also from indigenous individuals who were not necessarily Christian at the time they were Christianized, right? So it's a similar process that we see in Belize happening during the contact period. I don't know if anybody else has any comments.
I would just add to that from some of my research more in the Yucatan area, but along the same lines, working with the church in whatever respect as it was morphing into these new versions was a route for power and agency of individuals and families in my experience in the frontier areas in particular. So as much as it was this power of oppression and disenfranchisement, it is also a route for some people to increase their position and minimize their disadvantage.
Yeah. Great. Dr. Harrison-Buck, did you have anything you wanted to add, or?
Well, I guess in our case, we spoke about the Baptist Church, and I could add in their case, their primary mission was among many things, but was education and actually the abolition of slavery. So in that sense, they, the demonization, that we often attribute to that. In that respect, they were advocating for the end of slavery. So
absolutely, I think that it's a very complex history, and certainly some players that we see are not doing good things with Christianity, but certainly others are trying to do good things and liberating people, and so we just have to be conscious of the bad and the good, right? And sometimes it's not necessarily bad or good. It's just, it is what happened and what occurred. So yeah, I think that's a heavy question. So I think we have maybe one more. We have a decent amount of time left. I think we were a little early, so. We have one more question from Dr. Morton. Thanks, Shawn, for asking a question. When we talk about cultural heritage in Belize, should we be emphasizing continuity or change? How do you find the balance that works for you and your work/context? That's a great question. Does anybody want to?
It really has only one answer, doesn't it?
Sure.
Both.
Both, yes. I think that's sort of the crux of it, right? We have to be conscious of tradition and things that last a long time and that are very important and central, but also understand that cultures change, and that's normal, and there's nothing necessarily wrong with that. And cultures fuse and they meld. And I think this particular period of time of Belize is a perfect sort of representation of that. And your guys' work is great at illustrating it, right?
Yeah.
I think if I could add on that, and this kind of ties back into the conversation regarding blueprints for a collaborative approach. One of the things that Ellie and Sarah in particular did in moving towards putting together the museum was to ask the community what story they wanted to tell, and then incorporate that feedback into not only how the museum came together, but also it guided our excavations. So I think that comes to, when you get that feedback from the community, that helps answer what are we focusing on in terms of continuity and change. And with that input, I think that we ended up with quite a lot of good stories to tell in the museum in particular.
Absolutely.
Yeah, for sure. I think, you know, listening to the community was huge for us. And also, you know, really hearing a lot of the older community members saying, you know, they felt like the younger generation didn't know how hard life used to be, all the challenges and the joys and the triumphs, right? But understanding those stories was a big part of, you know, sharing those stories and having more of that intergenerational dialogue in how life used to be and how it's changing today because of obviously various things, right? From technology to roads connecting the community, et cetera, et cetera. So that, you know, that was really, as Adam was saying, you know, really key piece. And I think, Sarah, if you have anything to add to that, you know, in terms of how we design the museum content in partnership with the community, what they really wanted, you know, to record there and what it did for them, you know, in terms of telling that story. Can you hear at all, Sarah?
I can. Sorry, I just waved because the automatic lights turned off.
Oh, you were having some audio issues earlier. Now lights. Okay.
I think, you know, the one thing I would add, it's a great question, and I agree with Elizabeth's response that both are important. You know, you learn different things from continuity stories and different things from change stories. You know, the continuity story that's sort of at the heart of the museum and Cricketry is about sort of the continuous occupation of one place by a lot of different kinds of people over time who engaged with the sort of natural world around them and the geography in ways that are more similar than different and really interesting. And that creates an interesting story, particularly for kids who is one of our target audiences. Instead of looking at differences and how different cultures did different things, you know, it gives a sort of shared common experience. So that's the value of a continuity story. And stories about change provide opportunities to look for, you know, for eruptions, for resistance, for sort of shifts in power, which are all also really important historically, sort of and culturally in terms of learning outcomes. So I think that the answer is both and as an educator, right, I'm always leading with the question of what is the power, sort of the educative power of each of those kinds of stories.
Absolutely. So I have a question personally, but I don't know if I should. We have a bit of time. Have you guys been able to keep contact or see how the pandemic has impacted sort of the collaborative work you had started in the museum and everything? I don't know if you have any particular obstacles you've had to overcome or anything like that.
For sure, as we all have. And, you know, I think it's certainly been a challenge to keep the museum open during this time. It is open by appointment. So thank you for asking that too, in terms of and posting the links there, you know, on the Facebook page. The Village Council is who is currently running the museum. So reach out, and if you want to schedule either a class field trip, right, or a tour, or just go independently, for sure they can arrange that, you know, pending the, you know, what the situation is in terms of, I think it's just day by day, you know, in terms of how we evaluate the health and safety. But I know Sarah and her colleagues have actually been really instrumental in trying to make the museum accessible even in the midst of social distancing. And Sarah, you want to talk a little bit about the virtual tour?
Yes, that sounds great.
It's posted, I think, so.
Yeah, so we had the great pleasure of working with a couple of education students at our college, as well as someone who's an expert in educational technology, with the Brea team and our partners in Cricketry to build a virtual tour of the space, which is free and accessible online. And the link is in the comments. We'll also share the link again on our Facebook page if that makes it easier to get to. It gives you a strong sense of the content of the museum. You can see the panels and the organization of the space. and provide some really some close-up sort of zoom-in opportunities on some of the key artifacts that the Brea team brought into the museum through their archaeological work, and also that the community donated as a part of the museum development process. So if you're trying to decide if you would like to visit, it's a nice place to start. For teachers, it can be a good place also to sort of prepare for what you might do when you come. In addition, as Ellie said, we had a series of workshops that we were partnering with the Museum of Belize and with our partners at Banquitas House of Culture, geared at sort of working with teachers and helping them think about integrating more museum and object-based learning opportunities into their classroom. That was put on hold, but not on stop due to the pandemic. So it's our hope to continue some of that collaboration and to help educators of all types figure out how to use these amazing resources that are available in Crooked Tree and through the Houses of Culture and through the National Museum more and more in their work.
Absolutely. You guys are doing such great work. I think that we should, we will probably want to reach out to you because I have many ideas going around in my head now. But thank you so much for doing that great work and presenting it here today. We have quite a few more questions now. One that maybe Dr. Graham can tune in on. Why are sites like Tipu and the entire post-classic / contact not emphasized as much in archaeological research? This is
I don't know.
It's a good
really,
question, a hard question.
All the tourists that come to Lamanai, they never go to, or rarely, I should say, to the sugar mill or to the churches. So I'm not really sure. I guess it's not very exotic.
Yeah.
I was surprised that no one asked me how I knew that Lamanai was occupied until the present day. Is anybody interested?
Yes, please.
Okay. When David first went to the site, there were two people living there, two Maya guys, Don Pastor, and they had lived in these villages that were there, which the Belize Estate and Produce Company kicked off the property, but they came back. And the first church, when that was discovered, it was just a mound, right? Nobody really knew what it was. And Don Pastor said that is where the villages used to bury their dead, but they didn't know it as a church. They just used to bury their dead there. And we did find burials that were in a position that were quite different from the 16th century burials. So I thought that was quite interesting. I mean, there's some archaeological evidence, but that was just mind-boggling to me.
Well, and it speaks to sort of the importance of talking to local people and getting their perspective and understanding. These things are part of their lives, right? Their heritage, it's important. So that's great. We also have another question in regards to between San Pedro Town and Lamanai Maya sites. How can these artifacts relate to the other Maya sites within Belize? This might be a bit difficult to answer because I don't know if we have.
I could probably answer it because I've been working on the Caye and at Lamanai.
Sure. And Tipu.
And they fit in with the sequence. San Pedro also has some, post-classic remains and a little bit of colonial period remains, and there's lots of classic and even pre-classic remains on the Caye and at Lamanai. So it is part of that whole pre-Columbian sequence. It's just that it's one of the areas that has been excavated for British, the British colonial period. And again, that is not a period that is heavily investigated in Belize.
Mm-hmm.
The Keys would be really interesting. In fact, I incorporated that in the talk, but it was too long. There's so much work.
we really hope to include that talk on a separate
I mean,
presentation.
Not such a rough place to work either.
Oh, right. We went out there, but it's apparently very, very overgrown, so it's hard to get to some of the sites.
The atolls still have a lot of ships remains and stuff. Yeah.
Absolutely. One of our directors is currently being trained in underwater archaeology, so
You don't
Stay
even need that
stay
on the
tuned.
atolls. They're all over the island and all over the shallow areas around. So,
So you don't
'cause
even have to do underwater.
no, I applied for a project. I never got the money, but yeah, because I did some work out there. But there's tons of artifacts, and you don't. It's
I can imagine.
unknown, and there's continuity because there's Maya material on the atolls. There's Spanish colonial periods, and there's British colonial period, and pirates. Lots of pirates.
And pirates, yeah, such an important period of Belize's history, right? The sort of establishment of Belize as a nation is happening during that time. We have sort of a question related to what you just mentioned. How has funding affected your outreach initiatives at Lamanai or Tipu at the museum, or at the museum?
That's a difficult question for me to answer because years ago I raised money when I was working in Canada for many facets of outreach at Lamanai, but it didn't work out. It's a long story, but it was difficult to get the funding. It was difficult to keep the buildings in shape. There was a craft program that the Canadians funded, and that worked well. But then we just could not get funding from the Canadians or the British to help with financial aspects. It's one of the things that I'm very upset about because I spent years, and it just pretty much went down the drain. So it's wonderful to see, what you all are doing at Crooked Tree, and I hope that maybe a younger generation will be more successful than I was.
Well, funding is always a challenge for sure. And so, and it doesn't, you don't just need it once, right, to do a project, but there's that ongoing,
investment.
That's right.
Yeah.
And so we are certainly, for sure. And I mean, and I think the niche knows very well too, the investment when you open up an excavation and want to leave it to the elements, you have to consolidate it, and that takes money and investment as well. In the case of the museum, we were really fortunate to receive a couple of grants. We had a grant that I got as a fellowship, the Whiting Public Humanities Fellowship, and so that allowed me the time off from teaching to be able to develop the museum. So I need to give a shout out to them for sure. And then the Alphawood Foundation has been really generous in funding not only the Brea research, but also helped contribute to the development of the museum. So we were really fortunate in that regard. And of course had all it's the not just the money, but also the time and the energy and the people power. So I have, the team, the Brea team, the community, and all the support from the village council, for sure, the village chairman. They donated the building. I think I mentioned that. And certainly niche, right? We had every branch of niche involved really in terms of their support in this project and helping and granting us permission to create digital models of some of the artifacts. I don't know if Sarah, you want to chime in here in terms of others, and of course our universities, UNH, University of New Hampshire, Washington College.
Wave your arms, Sarah.
You're
Let's turn off.
I'm in the dark again. I appreciate the emphasis, but it does make it a little awkward. I think we've done a nice job laying out all of our support, and I would just say, non-monetary support, particularly from our collaborators and colleagues at the school in Crooked Tree, and also from our students who we've really had the great pleasure of bringing into a variety of parts of this project, and who have enjoyed their time in Belize and what they've learned there as well.
Awesome. Well, I just want to say, Dr. Graham, I think that you've done a lot of the groundwork in getting these issues to the forefront, and really helped probably lay the foundation so that the next generation can bring these issues out, right? So you have done great work, and I think with these new funding opportunities and people understanding the need and the importance of it, it's really becoming sort of central, and we hope to only see that continue, right? So I think we are about out of time for our live Q&A, and it is lunchtime. So thank you to all of our presenters again so much.
Thank you.
Yes, it's supper time for Dr. Graham. Yeah, you're in Paris, I think, right?
No, London.
Oh, London, right. Ala is in Paris. So we also want to make sure to thank the national channel for broadcasting the symposium on their cable channel. You can tune in there or back here on YouTube and Facebook after our lunch break. And thank you guys again. Have a great lunch or dinner. And we'll see you again around 12:30 Belize time.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, thank you.